Thank you, and I apologize for pushing the speakers, but others also want to speak. Now we have the comments by Professor Antoni Dudek, who has been the head of the research department of the Institute of National Remembrance, and he's also a associate professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Please.
Dziękuję bardzo za zaproszenie.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. My comment will be twofold, because it is my impression that the presentations delivered in this panel belong to two different areas. But before we embark on comments, let me provide a general comment related to the title and the motive of the conference. The notion of transitional justice, which gives rise to some doubts on my part. It suggests that we have to do with some other type of justice, different from the so-called universal justice, the kind of justice that is tailor-made and is to be applied in the countries that have just quit dictatorship and are in the transitional phase. And the main thrust of my criticism is that on many occasions in Poland and also beyond, there were charges leveled at all attempts of coming to terms with communism, and we were often accused that we tried to create certain special extraordinary legal procedures in order to try people responsible for communist crimes, and that this is incompatible with a modern law-abiding state governed by the rule of law. Such charges are also leveled at the National Remembrance Institute, especially in its section dealing with prosecuting and settlement of crimes perpetrated by the security apparatus. So I think that this term of transitional justice is somewhat ambiguous. I would rather like to use the term of settling, getting settled with the past, coming to terms with the past. And this coming to terms with the past has its legal dimension, and this is the main thrust of our conference. But settlement with the past has also its historical and educational dimension, the ethics of memory, if you like it. So this is my general disclaimer before I embark on my two comments. This is about my reservations concerning the notion of transitional justice. And now let me comment on the paper by Mr. Saygun Gkariksel. I would like to try to explain how come that the situation arose, the situation which gives us a sense of injustice. This concerned Mr. Dzieduszycki as much as many other people who were charged with being collaborators of a secret security system in Poland without giving them access to the files, to the documents underpinning the charge. To my mind, the origin of this problem is the wrong understanding of secret files. As you know, in Poland, much of the files were destroyed, and there are certain secret collaborators on whom we have lots of files to be made available, and there are other people about whom we have no files whatsoever. And now, in the vetting law or in the lustration law, we have a statement that people running for a position in the state should make a declaration as to their former cooperation with the security system under communism. And people who make such declarations have the right to inspect the files in the National Remembrance Institute. However, there is a proviso saying that secret collaborators cannot have any access to files whatsoever. This presumption is logical and just, but unfortunately, it led to a situation where people who have been charged with being accomplices, people who never sought any public offices, could have no access to such documents either. So this is a situation which is a vicious circle. Is there any way out of a situation? Yes, there is a way out. And the way out is to decide that everyone will have access to documents, to files, no matter of their status in the past. So people who were victims, people who were accomplices, people who were collaborators, because it might have happened that a person was first a collaborator but then a victim of the state apparatus. And it might have been so that people were first forced to collusion and then they decided to work in the opposition. So such people should have access to documents, to files. And this solution doesn't exhaust the problem with availability of documents. For years, I've been advocating for a general universal access to documents. However, I decided to back down from my original position as I read new documents and as I spoke to people who were victims of the communist special forces. Namely, such persons often mentioned a fact to me that such documents contained tons of sensitive information about their private lives, and that making such documents publicly available after years would be like penalizing them again years after. So if we make available a file of the former collaborators, and if we, in order to prove that he was collaborating, and at the same time we revealed the fact that this person was reporting on his nearest and dearest, this will be a trauma to his family, to his friends. So I think that the availability should be broad, but it should not be universal. Documents should be made available to the people concerned, victims and collaborators alike, that they should be available to scholars, and they should be made available to journalists. Mind you, providing access to journalists may be a sensitive issue because journalists may reveal certain sensitive information and violate personal interest of individual people, but we have courts to resolve on such issues. However, universal availability of files would be technically unfeasible and would expose many people to new penalization by revealing sensitive information, unjust information. So this is by way of my comment to Mr. Saigun Gukariksel. As for the two previous papers, I think that we have seen a description of a situation in two countries exiting communist dictatorship dictatorship, Ukraine and Slovakia. Two different countries that find themselves on two different stages in getting settled with the past. This is an obvious case. Slovakia, in spite of all their weaknesses, is by far much more advanced than Ukraine is. Nevertheless, you have noted a number of similarities in the situation of the two countries concerned, and those similarities would be common for the whole region, I think. And even going beyond the European context, we might find some similarities in Latin America as they are trying to come to terms with their dictatorship past, all the rightist dictatorships, military dictatorships, and there are striking resemblances here because dictatorships are similar. The very nature of dictatorship is more or less the same. However, let me limit myself to the European context. There are 6 main reasons, to my mind, which result in a situation where getting settled with the past is as difficult as it is. It meets opposition and will probably never be finished, completed in a satisfactory manner. It will be stopped in many countries on different stages. The first reason, which is an obvious reason mentioned by Professor Dudek at the outset of his paper, is that the collapse of communist dictatorships happened from the inside out, so to say. It was, in a way, provoked by the communist authorities. They were trying to originate a process that was called in Russia perestroika, and yet they tried to maintain power also after collapse of their power, of their political power. And their influence was used to block any settlement processes. Mind you, in many cases, when we speak about the influence exerted by ex-communists, we limit ourselves to the world of politics and social and secret police. However, their presence was to be felt also in the administration of justice, in the courts, in prosecutors' offices. These structures in most of the countries concerned have never been changed, so any attempt to legally get settled with communism was encountered massive resistance. Also, no changes were introduced in the academia, in the universities, institutions of education. And as a result of that, the public awareness of the problem was less acute. Surprisingly, and many intellectuals and opposition leaders were quite shocked by that, now that the communist system collapsed, people were not breathing in freedom enthusiastically, rejecting all the wrongdoing of the communism. This was a happy illusion, unfortunately. All too early was it realized that much of the post-communist societies would have some yearning for communism. Not so much the regime, but the social security, the welfare provided to them. As a result of that, in most of the post-communist countries, the leftist groupings were able to seize power again. This was evident in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, where as early as in the 1990s, communists regained power. Czech Republic and Germany being the only cases singled out, and Germany cannot be compared to other post-communist countries. So these are the two countries where communists have never regained power after 1990. So this is another factor that needs to be considered. In this regard, we must remember about education. If schools provided more information and training about dictatorship and the era of dictatorship, the young generation who is becoming empowered now would be more inclined to get settled with the past. It turns out, however, that the young people do not care. They are not interested. The third factor, which had its significant impact on the hampering of or limitation of settling with the past processes, was no consensus, no consent among main political parties, opposition parties. So they were not of one mind, even if they were all emerging from democratic opposition. They could not agree among themselves about the format of getting settled with the past, of coming to terms with the past. In Poland, sooner or later, we reached a consensus about our alliance with the world of the West. Likewise, in Hungary, in Czech Republic, then in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Romania, in Bulgaria, aspirations to join NATO and the European Union started emerging, and people were of one mind in this respect. But people were never in one mind as for getting settled with the past, not only with the communist parties, but there was no consensus. There was no agreement about how to come to terms with the past. There were political forces that advocated deep vetting, deep lustration, and decommunization. The other parties would say that this was like a witch hunting, incompatible with the modern rule of law. So this dispute, very violent in Poland as it was, resulted in a situation where nobody would gain the upper hand. And as a result of that, some of the decisions were postponed. And we can clearly see this using the example of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, where the Orange Revolution prevailed. President Yushchenko was trying to do something, but then Prime Minister Tymoshenko was against him, even if she advocated de-Sovietization of Ukraine beforehand. There was a moment in time when they started to disagree very actively, and the whole initiative was uprooted. The fourth factor that I wish to mention is the attitude of the West. The West decided to marginalize the importance of the process. They wanted to get post-communist countries on board, both in NATO and in the European Union. The countries seeking EU membership and NATO membership needed to comply with a number of conditions. For NATO, this was the civilian control over the army. In the EU case, this was reaching certain civilizational benchmarks, standards, but neither in NATO nor in EU would the coming to terms with dictators past be a precondition to seek membership. So this was left to the decision of the local elites and political elites, ruling elites. So there was no pressure to be exerted. There was a pressure exerted on the consolidation of the rule of law or getting toward the taxation system, fiscal discipline, etc. So this is the fourth factor. Now let me come to the fifth factor, which may not appear significant, but to my mind it is an important factor and it cannot be forgotten: the situation in Russia. All the countries under our discussion released themselves from the Russian rule. The Russian rule, which lasted half a century, if not more. It implies that massive Russian influence was still preserved in those respective countries. Also in Russia, in Russian archives, in Russian files, there is a lot of information to be found about the elites in post-communist countries. In Russia, no attempt has been taken whatsoever in order to get settled with the past. The archives are closed. The situation is beginning to change, but not significantly. And as a result of that, there was no impulse sent from Russia. The impulse that would be sent if their archives were opened and if many things came to light, especially concerning the satellite countries, societies, and the dependencies that there were. In consequence, this might trigger off a shock that would be very favorable for getting settled with the past. So a very crucial evidence of the significance of the Russian archives is the whole dispute that we have in Poland about the imposition of a martial law. The basic information against General Jaruzelski in Poland comes from Russian archives, from no other sources but from Russian archives. So there is an ongoing dispute, and if the information from Russia would be more available, our debate would be more active. So these are the 5 factors which, in my mind, resulted in a situation where the process of getting settled with the past was somewhat hampered and started to lose its momentum. That being said, we must note that in individual countries, the processes develop at different pace, and this is not to be changed. It is in the interest of democratic Europe to lend support to those processes. So this is a challenge to politicians from our part of Europe to make people aware, to make their opposite numbers in the West realize that getting settled with the communist heritage is as important as getting settled with a Nazi, with a fascist past, and that getting settled with those two totalitarianisms is equally important, and that the communist legacy is even less palatable because it has been lasting for a long period of time and left it mark on the life of societies in Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dudek.